Yeah, I guess I can record.
All right, thank you so much.
All right, cool. Um, all right, so debating on the motion, this House believes that trade unions and labor protection laws should be suspended during times of economic crisis. I'd like to call on Prime Minister to open this debate. Also, please time yourselves.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
So for gender pronouns, I'd just like to reiterate they, she, and for POIs, please do them in voice because I won't be able to look at the chat. Okay, let me just set up my timer. Okay. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. When every company is clawing and scraping by to stay afloat, we think that the state has obligation to help them. And in the long term, we think that this also will help the people on the ground, right? On opposition side, you allow the vast majority of individuals under these trade unions to suffer largely because you make it harder for the company to stay afloat, right? So then let's characterize a few things. First off, what is a trade union? What are they? We think that this happens. These are like labor unions that happen on larger scales, which means they exist in general between the employee and the state, right? And secondly, labor protection laws. These are laws put in place to protect employees so that they don't get exploited or underpaid and etc. Right? So then let's contextualize, right? What is then an economic crisis? These look like firstly periods of declining economic activity across an economy, e.g. people are not buying and selling goods enough or employing people enough, right? Secondly is that companies and corporations have failed or have had declining profits wherein they aren't able to meet demand with the supply. And thirdly, we think that this is a time when companies are at their tightest moment and having to enforce a skeleton workforce like in COVID-19, laying people off in order to cope with the changes in the economy and most especially the existence of the crisis, right? So then our model, 2 points to this. Firstly, what does the spending then look like? Insofar as the company is still unable to uplift themselves, we think that trade unions and labor protection laws won't be enforced, right? This is because the state recognizes that the companies being able to uplift themselves is necessary to be able to survive and get out of that crisis. Secondly, we think that you have to prove that you need to do this in order to keep your company afloat. And when these companies are afloat, the government recognizes this and it will be enforced back again, right? Second point of the model, right? What will our world look like? We think that we're still going to enforce like health and safety protocols. That means that companies have the obligation to keep you safe and protected because the state has other principles like protecting yourself. This looks like, i.e., not like super exploitative like working hours because this affects your health, and we're not going to like let companies hurt their employees, right? So then the standard then, right? What is a standard when we have to suspend things? We think that there's firstly necessity and secondly sustainability. Note that if opposition fails to abide by these standards, the arguments are out of the debate and are likely unnuanced as a result. The burden then is that firstly prove why employees are better off on our side, and secondly prove where companies are able to survive amidst the economic crisis. Moving on to the first argument, right? Why the suspension ought to be justified. What is the importance of this, right? The argument is important for the reason that if we're able to prove why the suspension in times of an economic crisis are both justified and necessary, we think that this outweighs any potential harms opposition might pose. 5 levels then of analysis. No, thank you. First then is what companies in an economic crisis look like, right? We think that this looks like cash flow isn't doing well and their main priority is to be able to stay afloat and survive, right? Secondly then is what are the measures companies have to stay afloat? We think that this looks like in the Great Depression when companies had to unemploy people because they had to cut down on their workforce to lessen expenses, and secondly, they also had to cut off a few of their benefits, right? Thirdly then, why is this measure that they had, why is these the measures that they had to do to stay afloat? We think that when you don't have enough money, especially in these companies, you have to decrease the money that you spend so that you won't go bankrupt and such, right? On the fourth then, these labor protection laws and trade unions are the ones, sure.
Don't you think that labor unions will be lenient towards companies that they depend upon in times of economic crisis and not be extremely strict?
I think that that's not enough, right? Because we think that we really have to take into account the nuance of an economic crisis and how detrimental they are to these companies then, right? So on the fourth layer then, we think that these labor protection laws and trade unions are the ones hindering the ability of the company to stay afloat, right? What does this mean? When you lay off someone or decrease their benefits, we think that it is seen as you're not following the contract of the economy and the employee. When you sign at the contract and you're going to get the benefits of that contract until the end, we think that although in an economic crisis, the company isn't able to fully fulfill these benefits because labor unions will strike against them insofar as the company cannot grow anymore. And this takes into account the POI that they just said, because like labor unions can't just let these things go, right? And the secondly, this hinders the ability for the company to grow as a result of them not being able to fulfill the desires and interests of these unions in an economic crisis where they're short on profit and meeting the supply and demand. On the fifth level of analysis, how companies stay afloat due to this suspension, right? We think that these are necessary budget cuts that we have to allow so that they can continue operations of the company until the recession has passed. The impact of this argument then is firstly, I proved to you why companies are being able to sustain themselves and stay afloat is important in an economic crisis. And secondly, in the long term, companies will be flooded by the court cases filed against them, and it makes it harder for them to survive on opposition side when they only had to do it out of necessity. On the second argument then on sustainability, right? We think that in the long term, it is far better on our side because we significantly solve the crisis faster and help the people on the ground, right? So then let's characterize. In these times of economic crisis, we think that companies only cut off the benefits and employees not because they wanted to, right? Not because they wanted to exploit their employees, but because they had to. They had to survive. They had to stay afloat. So sustainability then is which long term is better then. On the first layer, on the opposition side, what happens then? We think that if you still have these like protocols, we think that the company cannot sustain themselves, even if we think that it can't pay its salaries without income. They go bankrupt and out of service, right? Everyone loses their job early on in the crisis, and it makes the economic crisis worse because one, there's less services to opt into, and secondly, there's less people to get income to actually like purchase things, right? And the second, then, why is this crisis bad? Even though you're going to get new companies after the crisis, we think that those companies will be a lot less stable, and it will be unstable for employees. The impact of this then is the risk and harm then. So why is it better on our side on government, this layer, right? I proved to you in my first argument how exactly suspending those trade unions will help the company stay afloat. On the short term then, we think that they'll still have some employees to benefit and pay while also staying afloat. The impact of this is more people in the economic crisis will have money and another service that will likely take money. This is so important in regenerating the economy, right? And on the long term, when they survive the economic crisis that will only happen on our side, you'll still have these long-going companies that are far more stable than like newly built ones. We think that they'll have helped people during the crisis, and after the crisis, they're still alive and a lot more stable than those, right? The impact of then this is that I proved to you why our short term and our long term is better on our side. So how we solve the economic crisis better and how our long term is still better. Thanks.
All right, I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. To open the clash for op, I'd like to call on Leader of Opposition. Here.
Just to confirm, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
All right, I'll just set my timer and start my speech. Just a reminder, I'd like to receive POIs through chat, so do not badger. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we're talking about the people in the status quo who probably would face a huge brunt of an economic crisis. This looks like the poor people. This looks like the most vulnerable people who probably have their daily income in order to survive or have a living at all. We think that the brunt of economic crisis is something that's worse for these individuals. We stand for them. We're very proud to stand on proposition. Before I move on to my substantive material, what did side proposition give you in their speech? Firstly, on their model. They talked about how all the policies that were suspended previously would likely be back after the crisis. But then panel understand that they cannot simply say it out in their model or in their policy, because they do have the fiat to suspend the policy, but they do not really have the fiat to say that these policies are likely to be brought back, especially because of the tendencies of the companies that already exist in the status quo. But secondly, under their idea of justification of why companies are justified to do that, we have two things to say under that. Firstly, we say that companies will have to bear some form of loss in terms of economic crisis that's largely symmetrical on both sides. But then, moreover, we're okay if companies have to go a little further and get a larger amount of loss in that instance, because we think that the people on the grounds are the ones that are most affected, because companies could probably regain its composure after the recovery has been solved and gain the profits back again. But then the brunt that the normal individuals in the status quo have to bear is high. But secondly, we think that even if there exists a labor union, there is very less likely chance that they're probably going to, probably going to be very strict towards these companies, because the existence of labor unions depend upon these companies. We don't think the unions are likely to kill themselves by killing the companies as a whole. But thirdly, on the idea of how employees will still remain afloat, we don't think that's necessarily true, because understand, panel, in the absence of these forms of labor laws and whatnot, companies have a higher incentive to actually let go of their employees, let go of their rights of protection, because companies have a very serious incentive to profit. And in terms of economic crisis, they want to get out of it no matter what. They're not likely to become lenient towards these employees in the absence of those laws as a whole. Three major arguments then from proposition. Firstly, how does this affect the laborers? Secondly, how do we get out of the recovery, and why is that better? And thirdly, what post-recovery scenario looks like, which will be explained by DLO. Firstly, under how it affects the laborers. The premise of this argument is simple. The prices that probably is necessary to buy products do not shift even when the laborers' wages shift as a whole. Why is this true? Because in absence of labor protection law, you're likely to A, give very less wages for the same amount of job that you did in the past towards these employees, but then worse off, B, there is a higher chances of these employees getting fired and unemployed to a larger extent. The chances that these people are probably thrown out of their jobs is something that's much more likable in terms of these employments as a whole. How does this impact people in general then? Three things. First, in normal situations, these employees that already exist in the status quo do not have welfare systems guaranteed to them. You're already poor and you do not have proper welfare system that probably provides the security in an individual level. We think that this affects the people having the most minimum of wages, the people who are probably employed and who are probably living their life out of the income that they get from these companies, that they cannot assure the basic standard of living that they previously did because they're thrown out of their jobs whatsoever. But secondly, we think that it affects larger amount of taxation, the taxation that these companies give to the governments, the taxation that like employees are deemed to give to the government as a whole. We think that these taxes are very much important for the government in order to utilize this revenue, in order to serve to these people in general. But thirdly, we need a stronger welfare state to legislate policies, especially in times of economic crisis, in order to help out the people that are most vulnerable through subsidies to these individuals and whatnot. In absence of these forms of taxation policies in the status quo, there is a very less likely chance that government has strength in order to support that as a whole. Before moving on, yes, you are. Seeing none, I'll move on. Second, how do we get out of the recovery? We can't say a recovery is a proper recovery unless all the people in the status quo are catered to. So, how do we really make this recovery happen? by providing people a safe space and a safety net that comes along with this form of labor union and labor protection laws. The reason why people have a form of confidence towards governmental economy and the entire economic structure is because they feel safe because of these forms of structures that already exist. We think that this impacts are twofold. First, they're likely to take down a lot of their like saving systems from the government as a whole, because the entire system is not something that's much more supportive to these individuals. When it's not supportive to these individuals, they're not likely to think about saving for the longer term because they're not sure where the money will actually go as a whole. We think that this is making situations worse off. But secondly, at the end of the day, when we recover under both sides, how we see the world, we think that there is a likelier chance that it is very difficult for these unions to get back and unionize. Why is that the case? Because companies do not have incentives to probably get out of the situation or get out of the incentives that they already have. But then during these times of crisis, companies are going to hold massive power. We think that this massive power is something that probably helps them. But secondly, we think that the government are not likely to be as stable enough. In these situations, we think that corporations' lobbying power is going to increase to a larger extent, affecting the government and the policies as a whole. We think that it is better if the companies are better able to cater to recovery in order to solve the issue for the most vulnerable. We're very proud to stand on opposition. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Leader of Opposition, for that fine speech. To extend the case for Gov, I'd like to call on Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hello. Just to make sure that I can be heard.
Yes, you're audible.
All right, cool. POIs in the chat, by the way. I'll try to take one before 6. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2. It is when there is an economic crisis greater than ourselves must the state intervene in the market to be able to have that kind of stability. I think that opposition misses largely the context in which this debate exists, which is to talk about an economic crisis. And notice how, even if their harm is only to say that people are likely going to be unemployed, I think that this already is something that is expected, most especially when you talk about things like an economic crisis. Look at how that's what happened in the Great Depression, how there were numbers of like unemployment rates. I think that people ought to just expect this kind of unemployment to begin with. It's not a harm they can claim exclusively on their side. But I'm going to also prove to you then why our world is better on later on in my comparatives. But before I move on, I just like to have a few of like some responses that I think just doesn't fit with the rest of my speech. One, I just like to call out LO tells us that government side does not have the fiat to say that they will be able to bring it back. The first response is literally, I think that government side has the fiat insofar as suspension literally means that you're not going to permanently take it out, but rather it's something that will be temporarily taken out. But even if, right, and this is already us being very generous to LO or opposition's claim that we don't have that fiat, I think that the reason, it's not the company, like we don't care if the company wants to be able to maintain these labor relations as something like to make sure that these labor laws don't exist even after the crisis, because it is the state that still has the ability to be able to determine whether or not this will be enforced, right? And why do we think then that with that kind of incentive that the state has to actually bring back these labor laws is simply because that people will still are there likely to rally, most especially if they don't see any reason anymore, like when the economic crisis has passed, when they don't see any reason for the state to maintain like this whole policy. I think that they're likely going to call that out. But second thing that they also said was to say that, labor unions will be lenient, and this is also something that came from their POI. Why doesn't this argument, why doesn't this idea matter? Firstly, they don't even prove why they are likely to be lenient, like these kinds of labor unions, because they recognize that companies are struggling. But secondly, it's just look at how contradictory this is. It's counterproductive if they want to be able to make sure that labor unions are actually effective and trade unions are effective in protecting the wages of these people and in making sure that they still have their jobs. If they want to prove the benefit of employment on their side, they cannot claim the idea that labor unions will be lenient, and at the same time, they cannot just argue that companies will be able to stay afloat on their side when they literally make sure that, oh, as much as possible, companies should be able to keep these people in their companies. But now let's move on then to what are the arguments. This is
POI.
where I'm going to be comparing it. I said POIs in the chat. First argument is that they try to talk about how it affects laborers. The idea behind this is to talk about that people are going to be harmed because they are unemployed, and the reason why this is like harmful to a larger extent is because they are unable to pay for their funds. And at the same time, they try to say that, oh, taxes are less likely going to be paid by these companies. But first of all, what is my response? Just on a technical level, I think that this idea of harming like taxes that goes to the state just is out of the debate. Simply because I think that taxes are actually being more lenient, most especially in times of economic crisis. It is not a benefit that opposition can claim explicitly on their side. But let's talk about this idea of the harm that people will be unemployed. I think that coming strongly from Kate, and notice how this argument still stands even coming from my speech, is to say that they argue that laying off people is necessary in order for them to be able to keep the company afloat. Because, and the reason why this is a much preferred situation is the comparative is so bad because the companies are likely to shut down. That means that people who they want to be able to protect, to be able to maintain their jobs in the short term, sure, they're still able to get their full benefits, sure, they're still able to maintain their job. But in the long term, if their company is unable to have like enough money to be able to continue their operations, they won't be able to have their job in the future, or like as long as the economic crisis still exists. So I think, but thirdly, right, is why do we think it therefore is even better on our side? Notice how I think that actually it can also work as a mechanism in order for us to prove that companies will be able to make sure that they are able to at least employ more people. Why is that so? Because simply because like when you talk about a company wanting to employ people, the reason why they don't want to employ people at the moment is because the moment that you employ an employee, you have that kind of commitment, meaning that you have to give all of the benefits that you stated to them, you have to give as much of those benefits, you have to make sure that you have that full on commitment, which I think that in times of economic crisis, companies are unable to still commit to that. So at the moment that you remove all of these like labor regulations, or you suspend it for the meantime, meaning that they are able to meaning that they will have the incentive to continuously employ people, because like at least they don't have to have that kind of level of commitment where they have to give all of these benefits, where they have to be able to pay these people continuously, or where they have to make sure that this person like you they have to abide by that kind of contract. I think that that will give them even more incentive to just get more people, because at least like they are able to like they still will be able to like pay it to a certain extent. But before I move on, sure, I'll take the point. Hello?
Insofar as you believe that unemployment will be higher under your side, which you do concede, why is it likely that your companies will be able to sell the same amount of products to people who literally cannot afford it?
I kind of don't get why that actually matters in this debate. But at the same time, like honestly, it's not necessarily that companies will be able to massively go back to where they were before. The important idea is that a lot of these companies are able to still stay afloat. And we already told you coming from Kate that the reason why they're important, most especially when you try to make the company, like the economy out of its own crisis, you need to be able to maintain the companies you have there. But this is where then I engage with the idea coming from opposition, talking about how necessarily are you able to improve the economy. I don't think so that opposition is able to actually weigh in on this issue. Notice how, yes, we care about the humanitarian aspect and making sure that people are able to be employed, but notice how they don't recognize the situation in which we are put in. But why is it so that the government side clearly tells you how you're able to improve the economy on our side? We already told you the importance of companies just being able to stay afloat, but at the same time, we told you the importance of this, that this is merely an idea for us to be able to provide relief to a lot of these industries, and to make sure that they are able, like to make sure that they aren't being being further constrained when they're already put in situations in which they are already much more constrained. So we think that this comparative to the wage subsidies that people won't even be able to access, we think that we have to be able to do this in order for the company and the state to survive. All of these reasons and more, proud to propose. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Deepan, for that fine speech calling on DLO. Here.
I'd like an audio-visual confirmation before I start.
Yes, I can hear you and I can see you as well.
All right. For POIs, I'd like to take them once again through either the chat or through visual indications. Just as long as you don't interrupt me in the middle of my speech, it's fine. My preferred pronouns are he, they, once again, and I'll start in a few seconds. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I want you to take note of the massive concession that existed in the Prime Minister's speech, because they told us, firstly, that some benefits will still exist, some benefits such as healthcare and various other like nutrition plan or whatever they were talking about, right? I want you to note that in times of crisis, and especially in times of crisis, labor protection laws are just as important as healthcare. Why is this the case? It is because a minimum rate of like wages that you earn is critical for your sustenance at a point in time where your economy is downgrading, because at a point in time where it is likely that inflation is high and it's also likely that your wages are being cut, you're able to afford less things. This again disproportionately affects the poorer people who are unlikely to have assets and savings that they can liquidate in order to get more cash, which means that their policy negatively harms the most vulnerable in this debate. We're so proud to oppose this policy. Few points of responses before my positive case. Number one, they claim that businesses have to stay afloat, and they give a lot of mech to this, but like all of that mech is like really insufficient. 3 primary responses. Number one, corporations generally have really big pools of reserve capital and assets that can undergo liquidity. That means that companies are in the best place in an economic crisis to be able to sustain themselves despite that sort of like constraints that side proposition is talking about. Contrast this with the ability of employees to sustain themselves, individuals to turn their assets into liquid forms of cash that they can use during the crisis. I think we clearly know which one is more sustainable. But then secondly, for companies to sustain, they need to have a sustainable consumer base as well. We prove to you that that is not possible under their side. Coming in from the first speaker as well. What do we tell you? We tell you that when you suspend these laws, you allow for corporations to pay lesser wages and you allow for corporations to leave rampant unemployment within that state. What are the impacts? Number one, although people earn lower wages, it does not mean that the prices go down, which is critical, because necessarily a corporation is going to look at its competitors around the market, and nobody wants to be the first person to lower their price, because that disproportionately affects their competency within the market, which means that your prices are likely going to stay up in the status quo nonetheless. The difference is that your income goes down. Second impact then is that the amount of taxes you collect obviously decreases, but you also reduce employment, which means that the number of people who require welfare in its essential form is going up. This means that you put disproportionate burden upon the welfare state to provide welfare to things such as unemployment schemes and things and stimulus checks and all of these other things that governments necessarily have to push during times of economic crisis. The lack of engagement there and their simple dismissal of, oh no, this is symmetrical, cannot sustain here. We need stronger refutation from that side of the house. Final response then is that small businesses need very strong welfares in these systems as well. This nicely brings me on to my second point of refutation. That is, they say that some people will still be employed. Let's compare this to the welfare and stimulus under our side, because necessarily at a point in time where you have these regulations, it is likely that you collect higher taxes from corporations who are more able to pay those taxes when you compare it and contrast it to individual employees within that economy. It's also more likely that you are able to collect employment taxes and like income taxes when people are employed, even if it means that the company is taking a short-term loss in that scenario. But furthermore, we tell you that the suspension of these laws will lead to high rates of inflation. This is critical even for corporations and companies themselves. The lesser collection of tax, etc., means that you get more corporate money into the market, right? This increases the prices of a lot of these products because nobody wants to reduce their prices. Refer to my MEC earlier. Secondly, then, given that people don't have jobs, they need to draw from their savings. They need to draw from their savings. They don't have welfare, which means that your confidence in the government also goes down. The third thing then is that conversely, on our side, good welfare can give you that confidence. It can also give you the stimulus check that you can essentially derive from that welfare, right? All of these mechanisms are significantly more competent in bringing you out of a time of crisis such as this. Before moving on to impacts, I'll take a point if there are any. Please make it quick. 3, 2, 1. I want you to take note of this lack of POI engagement as well. 3 impacts that this argument then has. Number 1, prices rise across the nations and they disproportionately affect the poorer people in these nations because the poorer people generally have lesser savings than individuals or corporations that are in the upper echelons of the financial society. The second impact then is that the lack of confidence in the state means that you get less investment within that state as well. What does this mean in terms of small businesses? It means that small businesses are more reluctant and hesitant to give investment into the economy in the first place, which means that all of the characterization of why small businesses matter in this debate, even if we were to buy them, will essentially collapse because nobody wants to invest in a market that the government does not care to protect for. The third point then is that the lack of confidence also means that there's a rise in political incentives to like, let's say, vote for populistic leaders or vote for strongman leadership, because the competent government that was now unable to give you welfare is inherently seen as a bad government. We think that's also critical to analyze in terms of the political aspects that an economic phenomena brings about within this nation. Third point, then in this debate on their notion of how you'll be able to magically reverse this suspended loss. I want you to, like, the first thing I'm going to do here is intuition pump. That is, a lot of suspended laws do not get reversed within the first place, but then I'm also going to give you structural reasons that are as follows in terms of why post-crisis recovery is significantly better off under our side. This is critical in this debate. The assumption here is that, let's say, both sides are able to solve a crisis with relative ease, right? Like, the time scale may be different, sure, but let's say both, like, let's take them at their best and say that they're able to solve a crisis as well. The question then becomes, which side is better able to enforce these laws in the future? The first thing I'm going to note here is that companies are likely to not want to reinforce these laws after the crisis. They want to extenuate their profit margins. They're likely to underreport their revenues. But secondly, even if not, since they were able to circumvent these laws and they were able to accumulate more capital compared to the suspended unions that existed under our side, it is highly likely that 2 impacts are true. The first impact is that this gives them more leverage and power to lobby against these laws later on, which means that their point about them being able to resurrect these laws does not exist. But secondly, it also allows them to pollute and monopolize a market that was highly volatile, and they're able to then dismantle their own laborers because there was no protection for them. For all of these reasons, you're screwing over the most vulnerable people in this debate if you opt into their policy. Very proud to oppose.
All right, I'd like to thank DLO for that fine speech. I'd like to call on Government Whip to complete the case for Gov. Here.
All right, am I heard?
Yes, you're audible.
All right, that's great. Give me a few moments to set up my timer. By the way, I prefer to take POIs in call, so please unmute. All right, hold on. Okay. Speech start in 3, 2, 1. If proposition is able to prove why the long term is something that we ought focus on, as opposed to the short-term benefits you get on opposition, we ought to win this debate, because the entirety of this case, the entirety of opposition's case is hinged on people getting benefits in the short term, but they never tackle, at their very worst case, what's likely to happen to these people after economic crises, after these companies collapse, because opposition side concedes that they're willing to let these companies incur, like, they're willing to let these companies gain less profit or spend more profit if it helps people, we think that then it's harmful in the long term. I have two issues for you today. First issue on where do we help the most vulnerable? Second issue on where do we get a better recovery? But before that, I have a few strategic observations. Firstly, they say that governments are unlikely to be stable at the end of these crises. We think that that's untrue for the reason that in the Great Depression, it was the state who made one, how laws would be later introduced to safeguard financial institutions and deposits. Secondly, for instance, then U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt introduced the Securities Exchange Commission and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which bettered the crisis, which helped the U.S. alleviate themselves from the Great Depression. So note how the state is still likely to act because obviously they have that state obligation. What opposition side debates on is their very convenient case where they negate the state's obligation, where they assume that the state doesn't exist. Let's then move on to the first issue of where do we help the most vulnerable. One, they say that we're okay with the companies going further and incurring more of a loss as long as it's able to help the people. That is because companies can compose itself after the recession. We gave to you numerous structural reasons from first prop and second prop why companies are likely to collapse. Because on their side, when you're unable to fulfill the contract that companies have made to their employees, we think that these labor protection laws and these unions are likely to keep on targeting this company insofar as they're likely to make that company lose more profit because they expect that company to fulfill their benefits. They expect that company to feed them and still give them wages insofar as that company is unable to compose itself. The impact of that then is when these companies aren't able to stay afloat during the crises, we think that these companies then are unlikely to exist or are unlikely to be sustained after the crises and help the people. Secondly, they say on their first argument how it affects laborers because one, the absence of labor protection laws garner less wages. Two, they say that laborers don't have proper welfare systems. And three, we need stronger welfare states to legislate better welfare. I have four damaging responses as to why this is not the case. A, first response to their first mechanism on less wages. Look, you're likely to have less wages irregardless of these laws put into place because it is an economic crisis. Companies are likely to lay you off because the market's need for your skills are eroded and they don't have any profit to pay you back. Therefore, your wage is significantly decreased on either side. Second response, I'll take you.
I asked this in a POI to your other speaker, and I said this in my substantive as well. At a point in time where people are not able to get jobs and have that sort of employment and income, it also means that your company is able to sell less products because the buyers don't have the money to buy it. Please engage.
No, look, you guys keep on negating the state's obligation, right? We think that the state still exists to ensure that these actors are going to be financially secure. And obviously, if you know that an economic crisis is coming, or if you know that a recession is coming, you're likely to save as an individual because of the fact that you want to make sure that you're financially secure during these crises. Like obviously, when you know it's going to happen, when you know that companies are starting to decline in their profits, you're likely to be scared, you're likely to act rational and save money. Given that then, second response on their second mechanism of how these laborers don't have proper welfare systems. What opposition had to do for this claim to fly was provide to us structural mechanisms and illustrations as to why companies are likely to be the best welfare system. Literally, they're unlikely to give you better wages or increased wages because of the fact that they don't have profit to fulfill paying your wages to the fullest. On our side, even if we don't have the best welfare system, we have then the marginal benefit that these people are still catered to due to the state obligation, i.e., they're likely to give you food and certain cash depending on your need. For instance, we see this happen in the Philippines where they're able to provide food to their people. Last response, no. Dealing with their third mechanism on how we need better welfare policies. I don't see how their side gets better policies because people don't directly suffer in the short term. Therefore, the state doesn't see any need. The state doesn't see any urgency to enact any better welfare policies because they know that these labor protection laws still exist. On our side, when the state is able to see people somewhat suffer because because of these laws being like suspended, we think that they're likely to act then. Last response, given that I've responded to all their mechanisms, their entire argument collapses. Let's move on to the second issue on where do we get a better recovery. They say that on our side, we get a better recovery because we provide people with a safe space and safety net that comes with these unions and laws. One, sure we concede that people on our side on your side will get the immediate benefits, but we already posited how the long-term harms is it's far worse insofar as one, you're likely to not have a company because the companies who's still providing you these benefits and giving your wages is likely, we think that their profit is likely to lose due to the crisis. Second, we talked to you about how companies can't pay your salaries without income, and they're likely to go bankrupt because of the fact of the lack of services that exist. Lastly, we painted how companies have the obligation to fulfill your contract. But given that this debate takes place in one where there is an economic crisis, they're unlikely to consistently provide you care because they're likely to incur a giant loss. What that means is that you'll have these union groups target these companies and just overall make it harder for the company to stay afloat and increase their profit, which like in the long term is able to still provide you your consistent wages. Let's then move on to the reasons why we win. Firstly, we elucidate that this suspension ought be justified and necessary because it allows companies to stay afloat and gives further room for them to grow out of the economic crisis without being targeted by protests that make it harder. This benefit then extends to how we're able to significantly affect more people by ensuring that they're still able to have jobs at the end of the crisis. Secondly, we bring to you sustainability, how on opposition side exists companies who are likely to be unstable and unable to fulfill their employee benefits consistently, given that they are largely the reason why the world fell into an economic crisis in the first place. We think that if you want to prefer a world where we're able to ensure that in the long term, these companies are able to still be stable, that we still have that marginal benefit of the state catering to these people, you have to side with proposition thinks.
Thank you, Govib, for that fine speech. I'd like to call an opposition whip. Hear, hear.
Just a sec, I'll just put on my timer. I will be taking POIs through the chat. You can just drop a POI, or you can also open up your video and maybe wave to me. Having said that, I'll start in a few seconds. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I want you to be clear on the binary in this debate. The binary isn't that on their side, they're going to have economic recovery, and on our side, we're going to have no economic recovery whatsoever. Because in the status quo, we can see that nations do get out of economic crisis even when they have labor protection laws and trade unions. The idea here is that on our side of the house, the process will probably be slow. The people that are bearing the blunt of the impact are different, and that is something that they had to deal with. Notice that we have taken their case at their best. We have shown to you why even after you recover, things aren't going to be good. But the only engagement that they do, which also comes in their third speech, is that our side simply doesn't work. They are yet to engage with the mechanisms that do work in the real world. And I think on that basis, we already win this debate. I'll be talking about 3 things in my speech. Number 1, which actors bear the consequences on both sides and what's the just thing. Secondly, what does where do we recover quickly and what does the recovery process look like? But thirdly, I'm going to talk about what does the post-recovery scenario look like on the both sides. Firstly, on which actors bear the consequences. And I want you to be very clear about how people act and how companies act. People, and we have pushed this from the very first piece, is that people don't have a lot of money. People are reliant upon wages. And during times of economic crisis, the ones that are going to be laid off from the companies are the ones that are extremely reliant upon these wages. For example, the poorest workers, for example, those who work in lower skilled jobs. Meaning that you need to protect these people, as these people are the ones that are the most reliant upon these things in the first place. Their only response is that, hey, people are going to be laid off on both sides, and somehow that's what happens in a crisis. But our side proves to you why government ought to stop these layoffs as that of its people in a larger extent. Their only response to this idea of government responsibility is that government has a responsibility to provide welfare, and that can happen on their side, that they can just pay people welfare and things are going to be solved. If government has the capability to pay the welfare that arises from companies cutting off on their cost, governments also have the ability to pay companies and bail out companies. I think that also happens on our side of the house, and that alone means that we win this debate because we can bail out companies and all that, and we can have trade unions and all the benefits that come from it. But notice that companies are fundamentally different from people. In the sense, companies are prepared somewhat for the crisis. They have savings, they have infrastructure, they can sell, they can stay afloat. The idea here is that we want to slow the recovery of these companies as slow as possible, so that we don't have people literally being laid off and not being able to afford food, not being able to afford basic necessities. And we're fine with the slow recovery. Because notice that unlike what the proposition would like to say, companies are not going to die off on the outside the house in the most instances, because unions wouldn't want to kill off their company which is literally paying for their wages. Unions instead the proper thing that unions will do is that they will negotiate for probably higher pay. They will probably negotiate lowering pay until the point the company starts to stay afloat and the company starts to survive. Meaning that this is not a contradiction as the proposition would like to point out. We still have protections because companies on their side the house will probably slash wages to like $5 per hour. Instead, on the our side the house, you don't go to $5 per hour. You probably go to, let's say, $10 per hour. The company has a hard time recovering, and you make sure that people also have food on their table. Before I move on, I'll take the POI. 3,
All right.
2, yep.
If unions are going to be lenient with their company on your side, that means then that these unions are likely to be inefficient and that company is unlikely to feel the urgency to provide the benefits.
See, here's the thing. I get your point. If the minimum wage right now is, let's say, $15, companies will want to pay everyone $1 or $0 because that's what they want to do. Right now, in the current status quo, trade unions make sure that that particular thing doesn't happen. If you remove these laws, companies are not going to stop at, let's say, $10 per hour, which is a rate in which they can survive and also pay the employees. They'll probably go down. They'll remove all employees and have more profit because that's how they survive in a market, by being extremely competitive. So you're not going to have any form of protection. We have some form of protection, we have some form of leniency, and that's the balance. But moving on, why do we recover quickly? And we give you 2 reasons as to why we recover quickly, which went largely unresponded. Firstly, the idea is that companies don't pay a lot of taxes. They have tax loopholes. They are oftentimes financed through debt and all that, and they earn through stocks and whatnot. But on the other hand, you can get money from the wages that they pay to workers. Workers usually use this money in ways that companies do not, and hence government can collect taxes from them more than they can do so from companies. Amazon literally paid like $0 in taxes. Google does the same. Apple does the same. And taxes are very important in this debate because taxes are necessary for welfare. You want to reduce as much harm as possible to the most vulnerable people who are probably going to get laid off under both sides. You probably want to remove the possibility of a populist leader coming in and saying, "Hey, I'm going to provide you everything." Their only response to this idea about welfare and the idea about earning more money so that you can get out of this crisis by financing safer options was that, hey, state will see that people are on the streets and somehow bring welfare. I don't see how we're going to bring that money, considering that companies don't pay taxes in the first place. But also on the idea of confidence, and the idea was very simple, that if you don't have trade unions looking after you, if you don't have the government looking after your interest, then you are scared about your position in the society. You're scared about your investment. You probably want to invest your money somewhere else. You probably want to take out money from the bank because you don't believe that the government is going to look after you. Meaning that you have people scrambling towards their money. You have people drawing out money from banks, putting pressure on these institutions, and you don't have a good recovery because the financial system is in a mess. But then, what does the post-recovery scenario look like? On our side, we agree that the recovery system will probably be a bit slower, but notice this: we are going to have unions. We are going to have all of these laws existed. Their side claims that they are suddenly going to have everything back. I don't think that's the fiat. The fiat is suspension, and we told you why. After suspending things, you probably won't get it back because companies can lobby and do whatever. But even if, let's say, they can bring back the unions, the likely scenario is that company will already have fired the stronger people in the union. The company will have already begun its crackdown on these unions, and they will have a more bargaining power. Meaning that these unions, on their side, the house can't negotiate for wage increases after the crisis has been over. Meaning that the wages that were decreased during the crisis will stay the same. They will not increase because companies don't have to do so. The unions are already powerless, and people can't have good working conditions. But on the our side, when the company does get to a better position, these unions are intact. Their negotiating power and their leverage is intact, meaning that you have a good recovery scenario. At the end of the day, if we are going to agree, make on both sides, I think on our side, the house, we have a recovery that benefits everyone, that makes sure that their wages are kept safe, and that leads to better conditions. On their side, the house economy somehow grows, but I don't see why simply growing the economy is good, why simply growing the pie is good unless it is equal. We are proud to oppose.
All right, I'd like to thank Opposition Whip for that fine speech. I would like to call an Opposition reply. Hear, hear.
Let me just close my door. I think there's a lot of disturbance here. Again, audio-visual confirmation would be nice.
Yes, I can see you and I can hear you as well.
All right, give me a few seconds. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two strategic observations before moving on to an adjudication of what this debate ultimately boiled down to. Number one, they only have one stakeholder throughout their entire case, companies. We, on the other hand, we give you three stakeholders that independently lead us to independent paths to victory, something that they never engage with. What are these three stakeholders? Number one, we tell you that the employees are the most vulnerable in this situation because in many instances, they do not have the same savings, the same assets, the same sort of liquidity capacity that a lot of companies have during times of crisis. Secondly, we tell you that we also help the companies at a point in time where the people who genuinely buy their products continue to have the ability to buy their products, something again that we heard no engagement with regards to. And thirdly, we tell you that the state in and of itself is an important stakeholder, which under their policy is likely to not be able to dish out welfare policies, but secondly are also likely going to have like vote-ins of populistic leaders, something that came from my second speaker's speech, again unresponded to. Even if you believe that they make companies marginally better under their side, they can't help the other two stakeholders, which is why we're already on an upper winning stake in this debate. But secondly, on their lack of engagement, I want you to take note of how they offered just one POI throughout like our three speeches when we are like willing to take POIs. They also only wanted to deal with the case that they thought we were bringing about without actually listening to what we said, because they never looked at what our counter policy was. We told you that we'll collect taxes and make better welfare state. We have symmetrical fiat as them. So I think we're reasonably able to do that. But thirdly, they concede a lot of things that we say. They concede that health insurance is important, and which is why they want to protect it as well. Which leads to an important question: is your job as important as your healthcare scheme? Because I would say that without a job, you'll go hungry. You'll probably not be able to buy a lot of the basic facilities that you need to live and sustain. If they concede that healthcare is important, they also concede that all of these other very basic necessities are important. They also concede that how jobs are more secure, even if it is in the short term, under our side. We don't see why just like saying it is short term is worse off. We think people having jobs is generally better. What does this debate then boil down to? Number one, how does the policy affect the people? Their only claim here is that we disincentivize welfare policies. Like, I don't see the logic of this. I'm going to give you 5 structural reasons with regards to why we win this clash. Number one, prices are still high with a reduction in income, which means that you have the same amount of prices you're having to pay for, but you don't have as much income to pay for it, which means that you're negatively affected. Secondly, we tell you that governments being forced to collect less taxes because of the reduction of these laws also means that they're less capable of giving out welfare under their side. It's not sufficient for them to say, oh no, governments want to give out welfare. Like, you also have to be capable of giving out welfare. Thirdly, we tell you that the disproportionate effect to poor people who do not have savings, who do not have liquidity of assets, is going to be drastic insofar as they're going to, like, sure, you may, like, under our side, what you're at least able to do is you're able to give them welfare, you're able to protect jobs for them. Under your side, you're not able to do any of those things given that your welfare system is very incompetent. But additionally, you're also not able to give them jobs, which means that they're going to starve to death. Fourthly, we tell you that this also leads to high levels of inflation because everybody only wants to hold on to cash without investing in assets, without investing in businesses, all the myriad of sectors that exist within an economy, which means that the value of cash is continually increasing without the value of all those industries increasing, which means that the cost for getting your cash in the first place is extremely high, something again that they never wanted to deal with. We better this under our side because we tell you that we have a better welfare scheme that both the poor people and small businesses can profit from. We also have more organic stimulation because people have the ability to pay for the goods and services of these companies in the first place. When you compound this to all of the benefits of post-crisis recovery that Sirsai has already talked to you about, we think we win this debate fairly comfortably. We're very proud to oppose.
All right, thank you, opposition reply, for that fine speech. To finally close this debate, I'd like to call on government reply. Hear, hear.
Hi, sorry. Let me just close my door real quick. All right, cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opposition can't win this debate for as long as they're only arguing in their world. Judge, in the speech, I'm going to help you navigate throughout the questions that both teams needed to answer to win this debate. Before that, I just want to take the fiat claim opposition said that we don't have the fiat that countries will likely bring these laws back. Opposition is really stubborn in trying to prove this idea that isn't even important. We still have fiat, even coming from my speech, because we proved to you why there are stronger mechanisms and incentives to which the state will bring back these laws. The mechanism they talked about is that companies wouldn't want to bring this back, but notice how companies don't even have the capacity, nor do they have the say to bring back these laws, so they don't matter. But also, we're talking about trade unions. This exists on a larger scale. The power dynamics they portray between a labor union and a lot of these companies don't even exist. But now let's go on then to the two actors that this debate really revolves around on. Firstly, I think that we ought to talk about where we better address the economic crisis. Government's case under this strongly stands. What did we tell you? We told you why companies are important in the solution of an economic crisis, and it was an important decision. It was important for us to prove that companies need to be able to do this to, for example, lay off people and not give them the same benefits they used to have, like before there was an economic crisis, in order for that company to survive. They have to lessen the wages they give to the employees, the benefits, and have to lay off people. It's hard, but it's a necessary risk to which labor protections are hindering companies from opting to this to survive and have money to sustain their operations. It's not the thing that opposition was saying that we're likely to lower prices, but rather it's just the idea that they have money to sustain these operations. But why were the responses from op not enough? They contextualize companies as if companies are operating normally, like in an economic crisis. They said that, oh, they have reserves anyway. No, this doesn't exist if you literally look at the companies in COVID-19 and like those that are affected by an economic shock. I think that they're already shutting down. They're not just being normal, but they also say that, oh, companies are just doing this in the spirit of being profit incentivized. I don't think so that this exists insofar as they too are affected by the economic crisis. But opposition's case under this actor wasn't even very clear. They only told you that, oh, taxes are important, people need to have jobs to be able to pay for the prices of companies, so companies won't be able to earn anyways. And they even brought this idea of like increasing the rate of inflation. But notice how this doesn't even work to be able to improve the economy. They don't prove why this exactly is the tipping point, but there are solutions that exist outside of this policy that also aims to address this. I don't think so that the fact that they lack the tie back to this is like the fact that they lack the tie back to this, I don't think so that they can argue this argument at the end. So we think that therefore they're unable to prove to us why companies are still better able to survive when we've proven to you how important they are in solving an economic crisis. But secondly, it's just to talk about where the working class is better off, right? Government side, opposition doesn't engage on the idea that we were talking about coming from second speaker. This is where we even tried to engage, and this is already us going to their world and protecting the same working class people, where we told you that if you even relax these labor laws, companies have more ability to hire people, even if they won't be paying these people normally and like in their contract, compared to when they don't have the incentive to, because it's just too much of a commitment. No response coming from their deputy or whip, which had the opportunity to do so. But second way in which we told you that it's likely going to be better for the working class is we told you that it just gets spread out to more people if you're not being like paid normally or being lower. But at the same time, obviously these people want to allow their companies to survive, compared to when their companies shut down, they won't have their jobs at all. Sure, in the short term, this is some like unemployment as something that exists, but we think that in order for you to still keep the company afloat and in order for them to still be incentivized to still be taking in people, you have to go on with this policy. Coming from opposition, their only claim is to talk about the harm of unemployment, but they don't also recognize the harm that unlike the like having a complete workforce does. I don't think so that they're able to even address the idea that companies are likely going to collapse. They just kept telling us that this isn't true without even engaging. Notice how the most engaging team in this debate is government side. It's not opposition. For all these reasons and more, proud to propose things.
All right, thank you, government reply, for that fine speech. You may now virtually cross the house and go back to the convening room. Thank you.